And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am your host, Soraya, as always, here on Where Did the Road Go? And before we get to anything, I'd like to thank people who have donated some money to us, especially Jack, who decided to do it twice. Thank you so much, Jack, and it helps us pay some of our web fees and stuff like that. With no further ado, however, I want to get on to part 2 of our interview with Christopher O'Brien. You with us, Chris?
Yes.
And we had you on a month ago talking about your new book, Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. It's a very epic book, running almost 600 pages, and 551 to be exact, I guess, not counting the pictures at the end. And it is probably, no, I would say it is the most comprehensive book ever written on this very puzzling phenomenon. I assume that's what you were going for.
Pretty much. Figure I'd take all the mud that I could find, throw it against the wall, and see what sticks.
All right. Well, one of the things, I mean, we talked about the basis of the mystery and such a month ago, so let's get on to some of the other stuff. One of the things I noticed between the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, which you break the chapters up through, there seems to be an evolution of this phenomena to some extent, with certain things staying the same. Can you explain that evolution a little bit?
Well, I'm not sure if I can explain it, but I can kind of throw out there for the audience some of the, I guess, trends and patterns that seem to emerge from the data. Essentially, the beginning of the 70s, before this whole mystery became a front page headlines and part of the cultural memeplex, if you will, there were quite a number of back in 72, there were quite a number of rustling cases that featured mystery helicopters. And it seems that before this thing really blew out wide open in 75 through 79, which were the peak years for the mystery, where thousands of animals were being reported in a mutilated condition. Prior to that, in 72, in Iowa, Kansas, parts of Nebraska, we had waves of cattle rustling and hog rustling, which I found very intriguing. It's almost like they tried one way of doing this and realized that by stealing the animals, it just created a fervor among the ranching communities in these areas that were being targeted. And so it seems like in 74, the fall of 74, we see a switch to actually leaving animals back on the ranches where they had been targeted. And, at this point, we're not really sure whether these animals are being taken somewhere, experimented on and returned, or whether they're actually being experimented on in the field somehow or in the pasture. And in the 70s, I think we see what appears to be a correlation with a proximity to where we mine uranium. There's like this weird nuclear element that seems to be there. Nuclear power plants, missile bases with nuclear warheads, weapons labs where we enrich uranium. If you go downwind and downstream of these locations, those are the regions that are the hardest hit during the 70s. And I think that's it's an example of what could be called the environmental monitoring theory, which my mentor, David Perkins, kind of arrived at in late 78, early 79. He kind of noticed this correlation. And then he also mapped in areas that were hardest hit with the above ground radiation from 100 or so above ground nuclear tests that were conducted in the Nevada test site. And if you look at maps of the dispersion of radioactive materials, basically, there's almost a perfect match with the areas hardest hit by mutilation teams. And so that's the 70s. And then in the 80s, we see it morph into something else. We may be dealing with an expanded agenda, or even a whole separate and possibly third, fourth agendas that emerge. This is when we first start seeing cases of animals that appear to be microwaved. Animals would die for no apparent reason. A vet would be called. He'd open up the animal and find that the animal was cooked on the inside, almost like it had been microwaved. And of course, these are just a number of cases that we can really point to. This is not in any way, shape, or form a one-size-fits-all answer for 80s cases, but we are seeing these types of postmortem testing results in the 80s that we didn't see in the 70s. And toward the end of the 80s, we also see what could be some sort of monitoring of other environmental pollutants, let's say, in the environment, downstream from Superfund sites where there's a lot of heavy metals in the water, for instance. And then into the 90s, we may be seeing some sort of bacteriological weapons testing. Down in Fife, Alabama, Ted Oliphant was a police official down there, and out of the 80 or so cases, 80, 90 cases that he investigated, he seemed to see some sort of connection with Fort Campbell and other bases down in the southeast that may have been involved, sending out helicopter teams that were suspected of being involved in many of these cases. So, we do see kind of an evolution through the decades, but there's no real, until we really get a chance to knuckle down and fine-tooth comb through the data and really do a full analysis of just this bewildering amount of data, it's going to be difficult to come to any real strong conclusions. But like I said, we do see trends, we do see some patterns, and the next book that's going to be the analytical side of Stalking the Herd, it's going to be a complete analysis of the data from the first book, and we're hoping to see some some pretty interesting results kind of emerge out of the data.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about some of the other oddness around this. It's when you say cattle mutilations, it's not just cattle. I mean, obviously the first reported one that made it famous was Snippy the horse, but there's also been one of the things you mentioned, like rabbit mutilations, where they take the head but they leave the ears and the body. Cat.
Well, yeah, the cat mutilations, there's been thousands of those. They're really super bizarre and spooky, for lack of a better word. There's been thousands of these types of cat deaths reported around the West in most of your major metropolitan areas.
And this is where the cats are just literally cut in half.
Yeah, like with a giant pair of scissors, and oftentimes it's a domestic cat that just happens to sneak out one night and they find it in the front yard or backyard clipped in half the following morning.
And that just makes it that much weirder.
Yeah, exactly.
And so basically it's tons of different animals. Dogs have been mutilated. What else have you encountered?
Well, sheep, goats, hogs, horses, cattle, bison, elk, deer, pretty much any warm-blooded animal. I did have a case with a cow and a mutilated coyote right next to it. That was pretty strange. We've had, seals, dolphins. There have been cases, allegedly cases of people, although, the data on that's very sparse because those are the least likely cases that will be reported. But pretty much any warm-blooded animal, generally herbivores, you don't normally see carnivores being reported in this condition. We had a very strange case in the 70s where a wallaby was reported mutilated in a Southampton, England zoo, and then 3 months later, a number of wallabies were reported mutilated in the Jackson, Mississippi zoo. So you even have animals like wallabies that have been reported in this condition, which is pretty disconcerting.
Yeah, and it doesn't narrow down any particular explanation either.
No. In fact, it just makes it all that much more difficult to figure out, I guess.
And now, on the other hand, you've had cases where things like someone found a gas mask. There was a really weird one with chaff from an airplane, and other different evidence. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, as we talked about in part one, it's very, very rare to find any sort of crime scene evidence, tire tracks, cigarette butts, footprints, that sort of thing. Oftentimes the tracks of the animal aren't even present. This is actually a fairly regular occurrence. It's really rare, to find any sort of evidence. We've had a Army issue scalpel was found in one case, of a valise with a cow ear, and I think a scalpel was found in the driveway of a rancher who was near a mutilation site. The Dulce Gomez Ranch cases featured tripod marks on the ground that looked like something landed there. The rancher went into town to get the New Mexico State Patrolman. When he came back, there were even more tracks. This was in broad daylight. Gabe Valdez, the head of the New Mexico State Patrol stationed in Dulce there, he found a gas mask at once. They found some sort of Air Force, a piece of Air Force, some sort of meter, I think for an altimeter type meter. I forget exactly what its function was, but that was found. Radar chaff has been found, in one case stuffed into the cow's mouth. Yeah. But again, these are real standalone, very, very rare standalone cases. For every one of those, there's 1,000 that are head scratches with no evidence left behind.
Right, and wasn't there one with like a handprint or something in paint?
Yeah. There's been some cases like that. We've also had cases with ritual sign. There was a case in Colorado that had a melted candle on the skull of a mutilated cow, and the actual parts that had been excised were in a plastic bag hanging from a tree right over the animal. That's one of the rarest types of occult tinged cases. We found law enforcement has found ritual occult sign at a couple of cases, but nearby in a number of cases. Early on in the 70s, one of the predominant theories that was promoted by ufologists, of all people, were that these were ritual magicians like Satanists or some sort of occult group was going around involved in this. And I kind of got the sense, researching how this particular meme started, that it was some pretty prominent ufologists, J. Allen Hynek, Jerry Clark, and others, that were trying to disassociate the mutilation phenomenon from the UFO mystery. And so, they inadvertently, I think, kind of jump-started the whole idea that ritual occultists were involved. And this kind of snowballed and became a memo that was sent out by, I think, the FBI around to, quite a number of law enforcement agencies around the country. And so this particular, bee was thrown in law enforcement's bonnet, and it kind of buzzed around a bit. And it had the effect of kind of prejudicing, it sort of steered law enforcement's thinking in that direction, which then kind of overlaid into media coverage. So it wasn't, it wasn't an unusual thing to read a newspaper article that said Satanists strike again, cow discovered mutilated, or, having that kind of ritual occultist angle thrown in. However scant the evidence was to support that particular theory, there have been cases that do kind of tend to suggest that, but again, they're extremely rare compared to your standard classic mute, where nobody sees anything, nothing is left behind, there's no cause of death, they can't figure out why the animal was disfigured in the manner that it was. So those are the cases by far that are the vast majority. These other cases, let's say UFO landed on the ground with little entities seen around a cow. There's only been one or two of those. So, you have to look at the predominance of the data and draw your conclusions based on the mass of data as opposed to singling out individual cases.
Right. And it seems when looking through the different decades, it almost seems like the 80s had a little less high strangeness than the other decades for some reason. Maybe it was just the way I was reading it, but it seemed like there were more, that stuff pointed more to like a government involvement and less really weird cases. Would you say that's accurate?
In which decade do you notice that?
In the 80s.
Yeah, the 80s, well, you have to remember the Kenneth Rommel, the ex-FBI bank robber expert who had retired and was hired by the district attorney of Santa Fe, New Mexico, to do, it was kind of a report on the mutilations to try to, placate the ranching communities who were really up in arms at that time. This would have been in 79. This is right after Harrison Schmitt, the senator for New Mexico, had a conference in Albuquerque trying to bring law enforcement and investigators together. Of course, Harrison Schmitt was the last man to walk on the moon. He was the senator from New Mexico, and he was getting petitioned by the ranchers, by law enforcement, to do something. So he started by having this conference, and it turned into a circus. There were UFO true believers walking around in white robes, and I mean, it really was a zoo, and several law enforcement officials refused to participate, and some of the ranchers got pretty upset that there were more UFO people there than serious, cattle death investigators. So on the heels of that, then you have the following 6 months, you have Kenneth Rommel, this FBI guy, conducting a study of this. He investigated several dozen cases, but at that point, I think I can speak for other investigators, and especially Gabe Valdez, there were no real high-strange cases that deserved investigation all through that 6 to 8 month time period where he was running around trying to find fresh cases to study. And so basically the cases that he did study were misidentified scavenger action, hence he debunked the whole thing. Similar to the Condon report that was commissioned by, I think, the University of Colorado back in the late 60s.
Right.
It was a similar kind of scenario where, with the Condon committee, Condon made statements before he even began that he was going to close the door on this thing and show that it was all a bunch of BS to begin with. And Rommel made similar statements to people before he even began his investigation. So there seems to have been agendas attached to both of those efforts. And as a result of that report coming out saying there's nothing to see here, move along, and about a year and a half, 2 years later, the release of a book called Need Evidence, which again was a pretty self-serving debunking of the whole phenomenon, saying, no, it's all just scavengers. That had the effect of dampening down law enforcement's willingness to come forward and dovetail their efforts investigating these claims with other law enforcement. And it had the effect of keeping ranchers quiet, because they realized by this point that by reporting the case, the only thing that was going to happen was that they were going to bring all this glare of publicity down on themselves. And so they, instead of reporting the cases, it seems like for the most part they would just drag them off to a bone pile or bury them with a backhoe or burn them and not tell anybody, so that they could avoid any sort of media attention and the invariable circus that often sprang up around some of these cases. So we see a dampening down of the actual reporting of cases. And it's important to know, and it's important for me to stress here that pretty much I've found over the 20-plus years that I've been involved in this type of work, that the higher strange the case, the more bizarre it is, the freakier it is, the less likely it is for the rancher to report it. It's when he sees helicopters or maybe strange hooded figures or something out of the ordinary around his ranch that puts him in a place of fear for his livelihood, for his family, and gets him angry. Those are the cases that tended to be reported, and still today, I think for the most part, those are the cases that are reported most often. Rarely do you have a super high strange case that is reported, I think, in this day and age.
All right. But speaking of high strangeness, one of the things I saw here and there is that occasionally these things are found in crop circles.
Well, only two to my knowledge. One was a horse that was like, there was a squashed porcupine in one.
And
wasn't really mutilated. I think it was just it just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time.
And did you say the quills were swirled in the same direction as the grain?
Correct. Yeah, the swirls were mimicking the lay pattern of the crop,
which is really bizarre. What's your thoughts on the crop circle phenomenon?
Well, I came up with an interesting correlation that ties in with the possible involvement of the subject of mad cow disease in this whole mystery.
Okay.
In 1986, the first crop circle with any sort of complexity was discovered at Cheesefoot Head in the early to mid-summer of 1986. And it was a circle. Up until that point, crop circles were just simple circles flattened down in fields.
Right.
And this was the first one that had anything extra, and it was a thin ring that went around the outside of the circle. And it was right during this approximate time period, within a week or two, that mad cow disease was first reported as occurring in England, very near where this crop circle was discovered. And for the next 10 years, you see the gradual sweeping through the countryside of mad cow disease, and you see a process of complexity that was unfolding in the crop circle, formations. And at the height of the crop circles, when the Julia set was laid down, which is one of the most, I think, bizarre and celebrated of all the crop circles, this was formed in broad daylight in less than 45 minutes. It was a huge formation. It wasn't there when a pilot flew over in the morning. When he flew back about an hour or so later, a little less than an hour later, there was this big, huge formation in the field. And right when that one was laid down, which I think was a genuine formation, a vast majority of crop circles now, I think, are hoaxes and man-made. They're works of art, really. But in 98, when this particular Julia set was laid down, and it does have quite a bit of interesting, high strange documentation surrounding it. This was right as England was finishing up the cremation, the slaughtering and cremation of 4.5 million head of cattle. Every head of cattle in the British Isles was destroyed and cremated because of mad cow disease. So you talk about crop circles and the mutilations. I find it very interesting that you should have a correlation with the most horrific of diseases, that we have yet, discovered in cattle, and that would be transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, which is 100% fatal. They call it now prion disease, and I think that there's a connection between the monitoring of the environment vis-a-vis through cattle mutilations and the possible monitoring of, God forbid, the spread of mad cow disease through the food chain. And that would be a really good rationale for targeting cattle in specific geographic regions to find out if mad cow disease is somehow emerging in the food chain.
Wouldn't that be just as easy to do, though, at a slaughterhouse or something like that?
Well, and that's true, but remember when mad cow disease broke out in 1986, we didn't really have the complete centralization of the cattle industrial cattle complex, if you want to call it that. It wasn't until later into the late 80s and into the 90s that you have the real consolidation of big agro creating these huge super feedlots and rendering operations. This is a fairly recent development in the cattle industry. So, and I also find it very interesting that the areas now that service these giant feedlot areas, feedlot operations and rendering plants, are some of the areas that were hardest hit during the mutilation waves of the 70s. And now, instead of small independent ranches in the area, you have a single super, operation. 70 to 80% of small ranching operations that were in business in 1975, when there were more cattle in North America than at any other time before or since, almost 80% of the ranchers are out of business now. And in their place are these giant industrialized rendering, operations.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that there could have been a conspiracy to maybe scare some of these smaller groups out of the area.
Well, that's a possible explanation that I've seriously entertained. I had a case in the San Luis Valley where two county sheriffs fingered a particular rich rancher who had appropriated one of the two commons areas in the country. The Boston Common is the most famous, but this La Sierra Common in Costa Rica County was this huge swath of land in the foothills of the Sangres that belonged to the entire community. And this guy wrangled private ownership in the early 60s. And by the 70s, he was trying to buy out his neighbors. And isn't it interesting that they were incredibly hard hit? One is one of his closest neighbors lost 49 head, either shot, stolen, or mutilated in a 2-week period in October 75. So these two county sheriffs went on the record with me and said that they were absolutely convinced that this particular rancher was somehow aiding and abetting helicopter crews that were being associated with these waves of mutilations. And they made no bones about it. They came right out and stated publicly that, John Taylor was responsible. He was somehow involved with these waves of mutilations that were occurring there in Costilla County.
Okay. And the work of, and hopefully I'll get his last name right, Ted Oliphant, is that right?
Correct.
And he had theories about the military bases being involved, and it was actually able to track some of the helicopters, wasn't he?
Yeah, correct. Back to, I think, Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
And there was, and when these bases were questioned, they just denied knowing anything about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's that's pretty much to be expected when you try to approach government officials, especially in the military. And Ted was pretty convinced that they were somehow conducting, biological warfare experiments and possible bio war games on unsuspecting ranches' cattle, which that's pretty mean.
Well, yeah.
And people say, well, Chris, how come the government doesn't get their own cows and do their own experiments, on their own? Well, they do. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows that the government does rent pasture, do buy animals from ranchers in areas that they're interested in. But obviously, there's an overriding agenda that I think is even more important, that somehow is supplemented by these clandestine cases that are being perpetrated on private property and to private individuals' herds.
All right, we got to take a quick 45-second break. We'll be right back with Christopher O'Brien.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And you can go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, wheredidtheroadgo.com right now. And not only are all the shows archived, you can hear part 1 of this interview if you missed it. And you can also come into the chat room. And if you have any questions for Chris, we'll pass them along. Now, Ted, and I should say, Chris's book is Stalking the Herd, your latest book, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. It is your 5th book?
Well, 6th, but who's counting? 5th published book.
Okay, all right. And what's the 6th?
Say again, I'm sorry?
What is the 6th book?
It's a biography that the guy who it's about hasn't allowed me to publish it yet.
Ah, okay. And you have another book coming out that was originally part of this book as well.
Correct, yeah. This book was 600 pages if you count the forward in the introduction. And as a result of having such a huge book, I decided to take out about 300 pages. The book was looking to be about a 900-page to a 1,000-page book, and my publisher, it's a 1995 book, so he's not going to make much money. Plus, it already almost weighs 2 pounds, so shipping it's pretty expensive as well. So what I did was I took an entire chapter of interviews, an entire chapter of analysis out, and I'm going to use that information and supplement it with a complete data analysis of the first book. So the next book is going to be an analysis, basically, of the first book.
All right. Any idea when that's going to be out?
I'm still working on researching it. It'll be co-authored with David Perkins. It's being worked on, but we're really digging into some of these connections between the TSE, mad cow, and the effect of radiation on areas where cattle are being impacted by environmental radiation. And there is the possibility that this type of condition environmental conditions can help kick off prion disease. And we're digging into the role of copper in blood and how that may be factored in here. It seems the less copper you have, the less likely you are as a cow to develop prion disease. The more copper, the more likely you are or the more susceptible you are to go full blown. So there's a lot of information, there's a lot of science that we're having to dig through, and I'm enlisting the help of some experts to assist us in this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a veterinary pathologist. I'm not a biochemist, and so we really want to do this correctly and not be alarmist or leave any sort of loose ends. We really want to have the analysis as tight and as pardon the term, scholarly as possible.
Okay. And I think that's exactly what this phenomenon needs. And it seems like it's near an impossible job, really, in some respects, because it's so all over the place. One of the things you mentioned in the book is someone actually had been marking the cows or looking for marks on the cows to see if they could find cattle that would be mutilated later.
Yeah, that was Howard Burgess, who was one of the independent investigators that was involved with Gabe Valdez up on the Gomez Ranch in Rio Ribas County, New Mexico, which is right around the Dulce area, around the Hickory Apache Reservation. And Howard and Gabe came up with this idea of creating a cattle chute at night and using various intensities and wavelengths of ultraviolet light to actually look at the backs of cows, because if they were being spotlit from the air, then obviously you'd want some sort of way to ID the animals that you were interested in. So they led them underneath a series of ultraviolet lights, and a number of them did have fluorescent markings on them. And when they went back to recheck them a few days later, all the markings were gone.
Huh.
Now, that's the only case that I know of where that type of process had been enacted by investigators. There have been a number of cases that have a little bit of fluorescing material that's been noted by veterinary pathologists when they examine animals. There was one or two cases where it seemed like some sort of fluorescing material was on the hair. But again, certain types of paint, certain chemicals, even some plants can leave behind materials that fluoresce under the proper lighting conditions. So, we're not really sure that this is some sort of fairly consistent MO or anything by no stretch, but that's one of the things in my cattle mutilation doctor bag, if you will, is a small ultraviolet light that I go ahead and shine on cattle. I try to create as much darkness as I can. Generally, I'm there during the day, so get under a tarp and try to read the hide and see if there is any fluorescent material. I have yet to find any on any of the cases that I've investigated.
Huh, all right. In the stranger category, you want to talk a little bit about Larry Williams and his missing bear?
Oh, that's a bizarre case. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that's a weird one, boy. In the northern end of the San Luis Valley, in the Sangre de Cristos, there's, if you go right over the Sangres into the Huerfano Valley, and pretty high up, too. He was way up, I think, above 9,000 feet. There was a guy that was living there, kind of a survivalist type. He had a pet bear. He ran cattle. He had a bizarre experience where something came down and he was in his truck, and it literally lifted his truck and set it aside out of its tracks. And he started missing animals. And coincidentally, up and over the Sangres, directly west of him, animals were being found mutilated. Nobody knew whose animals they were. So these animals were coming out of nowhere. Of course, Williams didn't know his animals were being found on the other side of 12, 13,000 foot mountains. Right. And the other rancher didn't know whose cows they were. I don't know if they were branded. The two never figured out that the others existed until much later. But yeah, he claimed at one point that they whoever these crews were, and there's some confusion. I mean, he saw everything from helicopters to UFOs to all sorts of aerial activity, but he kind of was pretty insistent that it was someone aboard some of these aerial craft had abducted his bear, his pet bear. So that's a pretty interesting case. It gets really involved. There's a lot of ins and outs on it. Unfortunately, one of our civilian investigating organizations kind of messed up on the case and used his name without permission and didn't handle the anonymity and proprietary information properly. And so he clammed up and was unwilling to talk further to investigators. It was an open case when he just totally shut everything down on us. He felt that he had been victimized as well, that he was missing time. He ended up with some very uncomfortable rectal warts that came out of nowhere that his doctor couldn't explain. It just some very bizarre stuff. So, careful what you wish for. You might want to live up in a nice, beautiful, pristine area, but just watch your ass, I guess. The only way I could put it. That is a bizarre. It's one of the more bizarre cases that I've ever actually, in this case, been peripherally involved with, because I only talked to him a couple times. He was pretty upset at the local UFO group investigators that showed up and started spinning his story in all different directions.
One of the things that has been brought up, and not because of your work, but in this other case, I'm sure you're familiar with the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia.
Yeah.
Where they also had their tongues removed, their eyeballs removed, and things like that. Have you ever looked to see if there was any obvious connection there?
No, I haven't. Because of the this recent mockumentary that came out, and of course I've heard of the case, but I didn't know about some of the medical conditions, conditions that the people were found in, or the cadavers were found in. So that's a case that I definitely want to look further into. Russia is a place that has a lot of livestock in it, and I'm surprised that we haven't seen more cases come out of there. We have had some cases I think about 2005 to 2010, there were a number of sheep and goat cases that seemed to be similar to the cattle mutilations, not as involved, not as methodical. And of course, as the media is wont to do, these animal deaths are blamed on chupacabras.
Right.
It's an interesting cross-cultural leap, I would say.
Well, it seems like these things have been blamed on everything down the line. And obviously the thing that seems to stand out the most to me is that there's people doing it. It doesn't seem to point to aliens or monsters or anything like that. It does seem to point to people, more or less, like you said, whether it's an environmental thing or not. But some of this stuff is so hard to explain. At what level beyond what we know of our current technology would we have to be at to be able to do some of this stuff?
Well, the Dr. John Andrews from the, I think, Iowa State Veterinary Lab, one of the top vets. I mean, the guy writes, textbooks. He is one of the top veterinary pathologists in the country. He was back in the early 80s. And he took a fresh calf that had been discovered mutilated and was literally still warm when they packed it up and took it to the college lab. And he put it on a table, and he took a recently dead calf and put it on a table next to it. And he attempted to duplicate the cuts. And he said that he had extreme difficulty duplicating the cut around the eye and also the removal of the tongue from deep in the esophagus. He said that they literally needed a machine, kind of a vice to open up the animal's mouth wide enough to be able to get in there and able to do a straight cut, that's perpendicular to the tongue. He said that, I'm a pretty darn good surgeon, and I had a real rough time doing that. And he said it's inconceivable to him that anyone without his, advanced skill could even do that in, a well-lit laboratory scenario, as opposed to, being out in a field in the dark with no electricity, no lights. It was pretty hard for him to explain this. And he said there's just no way that this could have been done by any sort of scavenger or predator. He said that's totally, you just rule that out instantly because of the condition of the animal. And this is something that we do find. We do find that there are cases that are extremely difficult for humans to perpetrate. I'm not saying that they're impossible, but we're talking world-class skill in order to perpetrate a number of these cases over the years. And there is a line, I think, that you get to that. Once you get beyond that line, a human perpetrator is not really a viable explanation. I think we are dealing with something supernatural, high strange. It could be ETs. It could be some sort of dimensional predator. It could be time travelers coming back from the future with real high-tech technology. There is some sort of, magical, it's what Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficient level of technology beyond ours would appear as magic. Well, that's the kind of scenario that we see. But what's important is that we're looking at thousands of pounds of physical evidence, and I really think that we should exhaust all diagnostic, complete diagnostic involvement in trying to ascertain, number one, how these things are being done, and number two, obviously, what is the agenda? Why are these animals being subjected to such cruelty? And one of the things that I've always championed is that this is a location-specific phenomenon. It's where the animal is grazing, I think, is a key element here. That's why the government doesn't do all this type of testing at the Dugway Proving Grounds or at Fort Detrick, the Army Chemical Corps in Maryland. They need to do this and to monitor specific environmental elements in regions that they're interested in for whatever reason. So I think it's a location-specific phenomenon. I think the vast majority of cases can be explained as either misidentified scavenger action or the ones that are perpetrated with purpose by humans. But then you have that, the extreme high strange cases like the Sherman Ranch case that we mentioned, I think, in part one, where the rancher was literally in the field when this animal was attacked and torn apart. He was 300 yards away in broad daylight, didn't hear or see a thing. We've had other cases where we have less than a 10-minute window where people were standing right where a cow was discovered mutilated minutes later. So there are a number of cases that just really kind of make you scratch your head and go, what the heck is going on here? Who are these guys?
And the Sherman Ranch, that's also known as the Skinwalker Ranch, right?
Correct.
And that's also where they found the bulls stuffed inside of a trailer that hadn't been opened in ages, right?
Right. Well, the bulls were alive. Yeah, they weren't mutilated. But yes, the bulls were discovered crammed into a horse trailer. And there was still cobwebs and dust on the lock, like it hadn't been opened in months. So go figure that one out. It's like they were teleported in there. But, of course, that's also the same place where they saw humanoid figures with dog heads leaning up against trees smoking cigarettes. So, all bets are off about what's going on up at that particular place. I was the first investigator up there, by the way.
Really?
Some people don't know that. Yeah. I was called in just as the article was being finalized for the Deseret News. Zach Van Eck, the guy that broke this story, was familiar with my work, and he said, hey, could you call this guy and at least talk to him and maybe go up there and just, give him a shoulder or something. He needs somebody to talk to. So I dropped everything, and the following day I went all the way up there. It was almost a 1,000-mile round trip, but I stood there in 105-degree heat listening to him, and he showed me the tops of the cottonwood trees that had been sheared off by an object that came through one of the portals too fast and couldn't break in time, and sheared off 60, 70-foot cottonwood trees. The tops were all lopped off. And this had just occurred because I saw all the branches laying there. Big 14-inch, circles punched into hardpan. It would have taken 9 tons of weight to do. A number of things that he showed me that really, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, and I've got a pretty good sense of when people are, being truthful, when they're really scared, when they're really in a place of fear, when they're, when they're amazed versus feigning amazement.
Right.
I'm pretty good at reading people, and this guy came across as sincere as any witness that I've ever interviewed, and it is the most bizarre case, I think, on record. And I'm really glad that Robert Bigelow, spent a lot of money, $250,000 to buy the ranch, and then probably spent millions of dollars monitoring it. Even if he's not going to release the information to the public, I'm glad at least somebody is attempting to throw money at this and really come to some firm conclusions about what we're dealing with. I think he's more confused now than when he was before he bought the ranch. That's a whole other story.
Now they did legitimate scientific research on some of these mutilations and stuff. Why did they stop releasing the information? Any idea?
Well, they never started. They never did release the information.
Oh, I thought they released some.
They did release information about a case they had in Utah where they found whatever that material that we use to kill people with lethal injection. They found that material in the eye. Is it potassium chloride or
I don't know
what it is? Potassium cyanide. They found it in the oculus, the eye fluid of the animal. The animal was almost devoid of copper. That's a very interesting paper that they did release. They also released a paper that equated the proximity of animal mutilations to there's a linkage somewhere in their minds to mad cow disease. Colin Kelleher, who was the managing director for the National Institute of Discovery Sciences, which was the scientific group that Bigelow funded, who monitored the Skinwalker Ranch. Colin is a microbiologist, and he wrote a really good book called Brain Trust, which links the outbreak of mad cow disease and the mutilation phenomenon. It's a really important book, and I'm really sad that so many people chose not to buy it and read it, because it's very sobering and a bit frightening. And I did use several sections from his book, from his summary chapter, looking at this whole potential link between mad cow disease and the cattle mutilation phenomenon. I think it's smoking gun information, and that's one of the areas that we're really going to be looking into as we analyze the first book and go and get the second book completed.
So how is it that with all these cases, no one's ever been caught, and there really haven't been any witnesses to this? How is that even possible at this point?
Well, there have been witnesses. That's not exactly true, and there was a guy convicted, but he was convicted in 1902. That's a $64,000 question. You would think that if it was helicopters, that one would crash, somebody would run out of gas, he'd clip some trees, and somebody would drop something, or that somebody would make a mistake. I mean, look at the so-called assassination of Osama bin Laden, if that was really him.
Right.
But they did land a couple of choppers there, and of course one of them had a problem and lost its tail rotor, which they had to go in and try to retrieve, I think, or blow up so that the stealth technology wasn't released to the public.
Right.
But mechanical things fail, humans mess up. And the fact that nobody has messed up, that this has been such a slick operation for so many decades, really makes you wonder. Maybe all this is ETs. Maybe Linda Howe's right. Maybe aliens are here gathering parts for lip and eye stew, or maybe it's high-tech chefs coming back from the future to harvest organs from illegal, protein sources in the future. I don't think cattle can be maintained as a protein source for much longer. Cattle are the most detrimental thing in the environment besides man. Yeah. They're the largest source of freshwater pollution, the largest creator of deserts, the single biggest reason why we're cutting down the rainforest to make room for more cattle. Some of the most horrific diseases imaginable come from cattle. We just had a release of anthrax at the CDC, and they think 85 people may have been inadvertently exposed to anthrax spores. This was just a few days ago, a week or so ago. Cattle are the largest, second largest, arguably, source of ozone-depleting gases. They belch and fart once every 2 minutes. That's millions of tons of methane that's going up into the air. And don't forget, we have 1.37 billion cattle on the planet. If you added them up on one side of the scale and added humans, they'd probably weigh more.
Right.
So they take up 25% of the land mass. We're not going to be able to continue eating cattle and utilizing it as a protein source. As more countries become affluent and start developing a middle class, one of the real status symbols of becoming affluent is being able to afford to eat beef. And so as more and more people get into a place of being affording the luxury of eating beef, you're going to have more and more beef being consumed by countries that aren't consuming as much now. The level of beef consumption in the United States has actually been dropping since 75. '75 was the height of the cattle mutilation phenomenon. It was also the height of the numbers of cattle in the United States, and was also the height of how many pounds of beef per capita we would eat as Americans. So it's been going downhill ever since, and I hope it continues to slide. But if it doesn't do it quickly, we're really, we're playing around with fire here using cattle as a protein source. It really can't continue for various environmental and health reasons.
All right, and that stuff is you go into a great bit of detail in the last chapter of the book about the mad cow disease and what we use cattle for, how we take care of them, and why it's not sustainable.
Right.
What would you say?
Let me put the disclaimer out there. I eat beef. I love beef. Okay, I will eat another hamburger in my life. I'm sure of it. I'm not like Oprah. I'm not dumb enough to say on on a radio station that what she said. And I don't have a lawyer that I can spend $1 million getting myself off a frivolous lawsuit. So I'm a beef eater. I love beef. As rare as you dare. What I put in the book. I'm a red, white, and blue American who loves my steaks bloody raw.
Well, what do you think the most overlooked thing about these mutilation cases is?
The most overlooked thing is the actual facts that are involved here, because certain investigators have been touting this ET, scenario and this ET explanation as the end-all, be-all explanation. People just now, I think, assume that, it's aliens coming down and gathering genetic material, because that's been what's been force-fed to everybody for 30 years. And I think the most overlooked thing is the actual body of data. Now that we have a book where all these investigators' databases have been coalesced into one place, you get a chance to see, the incredible, enormous number of cases and how varied they are, and how, we have cases where, helicopters are seen around the site, ranchers fire at them, the helicopters fire back. I mean, those aren't aliens flying helicopters. They don't use .6s. So, I think the most overlooked thing is the actual, incredible amount of documented information about these cases, and that the aberrant cases of the UFO cases or the occult cases, they're very few and far between compared to the huge amount, thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of the classic mutilation.
All right. And I guess my last question for you for tonight is, how do you feel when you've spent so many years on this work and someone just throws out an article dismissing it without any kind of real research or anything like that?
Well, and that's happened a bunch. All I can do is try to privately contact them, maybe spank them a little bit on some website or whatever, and put my comment in about, well, if you did your research, you wouldn't say something, so, ill-conceived as that, or whatever my comment is. But then I do try to contact them publicly, because we need people to be interested enough to get involved and help the ranching community solve these cases. They don't appear to be as prevalent as they were, obviously, in the 70s, but it's still a problem. Cases are still being reported. So I think we don't want to scare people away that are interested enough to at least address the subject, but we need to educate them. We need to get them up to speed on what this actually is, what kind of data we actually have to go on, and to really be as objective about it as possible, I think, is really important. So that would be. I don't want to scare people away by spanking them for making ill-considered comments or whatever. But at the same time, they're just contributing to the ignorance of the American public and the Western public.
All right. Okay. And the book, again, is Stalking the Herd, Unraveling the Cattle Mutilation Mystery. You also have a trilogy of books out on the San Luis Valley?
Correct.
And another one called Stalking the Tricksters, right?
Which is the trickster archetype is very much involved in this whole mystery of the cows, boy, I'll tell you.
So all these books do involve, to some degree, the cattle mutilation mystery, right?
Well, yeah, they're mentioned in all of them. In the trickster book, it's part of a chapter, yeah.
Okay. And the new book will be out whenever you get it done, but people can also check you out. What's your website?
Well, I have the Paracast radio show every Sunday night. It's theparacast.com.
Right.
Our archive, all for free. We've been around for 8 years. And my website is ourstrangeplanet.com. It's a strange planet. It's ourstrangeplanet.com. And I do have a dedicated site, stalkingherd.com.
Okay, all right. And you're also a musician.
I am indeed.
And you've had, how many bands have you been in?
Oh, God, I lost count. I was in 4 or 5 in New York, a big one in Boston, 4 or 5 in Colorado, and I'm in a band now. It's a progressive Native American kind of rock band called Black Raven.
Black Raven. Okay, and we're going to hear something from which band?
Say again now?
We're going to hear something here from one of your bands. Which band is it?
Oh, no, that's from my first solo album. I did an album imagining what indigenous music would sound like in the 22nd century.
Oh.
This is a piece I did that kind of second-guessed what Australian Aborigine music will sound like in 100 years.
Huh. All right, I can actually see that. This is a piece called Dreamtime, and I thank you so much for spending some time with us and talking to us about this.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for having me on, and I'll come back and give you an update.
All right, that sounds great. Maybe we can have you back when you have your analysis book out.
There you go.
All right, so here is Dreamtime, and is this just under Christopher O'Brien then?
Mandala is my solo kind of world music name.
Okay, Mandala. And www.where'dtheroadgo.com. The Last Exit for the Lost is up next.